Everyone, hello. I hope all of you are doing well. So let's quickly get started and talk about how do we really define deadlock. Okay. So whenever you have a process in an operating system, it tries to use the processes or the resources in the following way. Okay. If you have any process which is running in the operating system, it is bound to use some resources. Okay. And how does it really use those resources? First is it can either request for a resource, then it is either using that resource, or in the third part it is releasing the resource altogether. Okay, now a set of processes is said to be in a deadlock state if each process in the set, okay, is waiting for an event that can be caused only if can be only caused by another process in the set. Okay, so it's like I am waiting for something to happen, okay, and that resource is actually held by someone else, okay, and that resource is held by someone else, okay. So it's like a dependency, it's like a deadlock. If that other process does not release that resource, I won't be able to get it, and we would be stuck in a situation where no one is able to move forward. Okay. In other words, each member of the set of deadlock processes is waiting for a resource that can only be released by a deadlock process. Okay. None of these processes can run in a deadlock situation, and none of them can release any processes also, and thus none of them can be awakened. Okay. And that happens a lot. Every process needs resources to complete its allocation or complete its execution. Now, however, the granting of the resource happens in a very sequential way, right? First, the process requests for a resource, then the operating system grants the resource, right? And then the process uses it and basically releases on its completion. Okay. Now, a deadlock situation is someone, right, where every processor or every computer process is waiting for a resource which is assigned to some other process. So I am waiting for something to happen, and that resource is assigned to someone else. In this situation, none of the processes get executed, since the resource the process needs, is basically held by some other process who is also waiting for some other process to get released. Okay. So that's what the overall idea is, and that's how we usually define the concept of deadlocks. Okay, so here you can see in this example, right? For example, there is a resource R1 and there is a resource R2. So in total, there are two resources which are existing in the system. Okay, now process 1 needs resource 2 for its execution. Okay, process 1 is basically waiting for resource 2 in order to move forward. Okay, but that process 2 is assigned to resource 1. Okay, so it's like I want a resource which is used or held by someone else. Okay, and that person who is holding my resource also is waiting for a resource which is held by me. Okay, so it's like I am holding a resource which someone else need, and that person is holding a resource which I need. Okay, so in that situation, a condition of deadlock basically occurs in which none of the processes will be able to move. Okay, let me give you another example. Let's say there is a process P1, there is a process P2, and there is a process P3. Now we have actually three processes in the system, and corresponding to that, we have resource R1, we have resource R2, and we have resource R3. Okay, so this particular process P1, okay, is basically requesting resource R1, okay, and it is currently holding the resource R2, okay, and then process P2 is requesting for the resource R2, and it is holding or assigned the resource R3, and similarly P3 is requesting for a resource, okay, and it is holding this resource. Now this is a very typical condition of deadlock. Okay, I am holding a resource which is required by someone else, that person is holding my resource which is required by someone else, right? And further to that person needs a resource which is basically acquired by me. Okay, so in this situation, there are three processes, P1, P2, and P3, and there are three different resources as well. Okay, R1 is basically assigned to P1. R2 is, let's say, R1 is requesting P1. Okay. R2 is requesting P2. I think the better arrows would be, yeah, I think this is also fine. Or you can use these arrows as well. These gave a slightly okay. So in this situation, P1 is requesting for a resource R1, right, which is basically hold by, I would say P3, not here, which is basically hold by P3. Okay. Similarly, P2 is requesting for a resource R2, which is hold by P1, and P3 is requesting for a resource R3, which is being hold by P3 is requesting, sorry, this goes up. P3 is requesting for a resource R3, which is being held by P2. Okay, so that is how the overall idea work occurs, and in this case, none of the processes are being executed. There is a cycle that is formed among all the three processes, due to which none of the processes progressing, none of the processes waiting, and none of processes progressing, and all of them are just waiting. And in this situation, the computer actually becomes unresponsive because all of the processes gets logged. So this is a slightly more, I would say, better example to understand, a slightly more complex example to understand the concept of deadlocks. Okay, and deadlocks are very, very common, and deadlocks, like I just told you that they block the entire system. Okay, so it's very, very important that either we avoid, in the first situation, you should always avoid having deadlocks altogether, and even if you do have the situation of deadlocks, you should have necessary, I would say, mechanisms put into place which can very easily unblock your system. Okay, so that's what the pretty much definition for a deadlock is. Okay, next what we will talk about, before talking about 4 conditions which can basically lead to a deadlock, we will talk a little bit about the difference between deadlock and starvation. Okay, because I've seen many students who do get confused between this, because you must have heard about the condition of starvation a lot, or like the word a lot in terms when you were reading processes. So it's important that we do put light on this and segregate both of them. There are times when people use these two terms interchangeably, but you have to understand that it's not true. Both the terms are entirely different, and it's important to understand the difference between both of them. The first point is that deadlock is a situation where no process, okay, basically proceeds and all of them is blocked. Deadlock is a situation, okay, that occurs when all processes are blocked and no process basically proceeds. Okay, here that is what the definition for a deadlock is. Whereas when we talk about starvation, in starvation, the difference is between a high priority process and a low priority process. The low priority process always gets blocked and the high priority process proceeds. Starvation is a process in which low priority process gets blocked and high priority processes basically proceeds. Okay, in deadlock, it can lead to infinite waiting. There can be a situation where the deadlock never gets actually resolved. In starvation, it is a long waiting, but it's not infinite, because we have definite procedures put into place which basically keeps a low process waiting for many time, but it's never like blocked or anything like that, or there's not infinite waiting. So starvation is a long waiting, but it's not infinite. Okay. Here in deadlock, okay, the requested resource is blocked by some other process, correct? That's what the entire idea is, that the process or the resource process P1 is requesting is held by or blocked by P2. Is blocked by other process. It could be any other process. Whereas in the condition of starvation, the requested resource is continuously being used by a higher priority process. Process. Okay. And the last point is deadlock basically happens when the four conditions, mutual exclusion, hold and wait, no preemption, and circular wait occur simultaneously. So there are four conditions and all of them needs to be there in order for a deadlock to happen. And if all these four conditions are there, to happen. Okay, whereas the condition of starvation happens due to uncontrolled priority. Okay, you have assigned some processes such high priority, there is no control over that priority decreasing or increasing, right? That basically leads to unequal resource management, hence the condition of starvation. Okay, so that would be the last point of our discussion over here. Over here, that deadlock happens when mutual exclusion, hold and wait, no preemption, and circular wait. Okay, when all of these basically occurs simultaneously, whereas starvation occurs due to uncontrolled priority and resource management. These are the 4 points of differences which very well define a difference between a deadlock and starvation. Okay, so make sure you always remember these points because students do get confused between both of them. So it's always important to know the differences. Okay, all right. Now we'll come back to the point where we will talk about what are the 4 conditions. Okay, what we know the names, but now we should always also understand that how and when these what these 4 conditions are which can lead to a condition of deadlock. Okay, the first one is mutual exclusion. Okay, whereas 2 or more resources are non-shareable. So sometimes if a resource is shareable, okay, then there's no problem, right? There can be multiple processes and all of these processes can use the resource simultaneously. But the problem is when there is a resource which is not shareable but it is requested by multiple processes, then that's a concept of mutual exclusion. Okay, and the concept of mutual exclusion says that even if there is at least one resource, okay, even if there is at least one resource that is non-shareable, right, that can lead to a deadlock. That is one of the part of the conditions that can lead to a deadlock. Second condition is hold and wait. A process is holding at least one resource also and waiting a resource also. And the very good example for that we saw over here. Process 1 was waiting and requesting a resource also and assigned a resource also. If in this situation, process P1 was not assigned any resource, it was just waiting, then it was no problem. Process 2 would have used resource R1 and then allocated the resource 2 to P1. But here, the process P1 was holding a resource also and requesting a resource as well. Okay, so in that condition also, it basically adds up to a condition of deadlock. Third condition is the condition of no preemption. Okay, now here a resource cannot be taken from the process unless the process releases the resource. So what happens is sometimes there is like an interrupt, okay, wherein a process is where a process is holding a resource and somehow an interrupt happened and the resource got allocated to some other process. But in case a deadlock happens, that means there is no concept of preemption. That means a resource cannot be simply taken from a process and given to another process. The process has to voluntarily release the resource, right? Then only a process can be released. A resource cannot be just taken from a particular process. So there is the concept of no preemption. Fourth condition that leads to, or the last condition that leads to the condition of deadlock, is that a set of processes are waiting for each other in the circular form. And for that, you could see a very good example in here itself, right? You can see this is a cycle. Resource R1 to P1, P1 to R2, R2 and P2, and P2 to R1. If in any situation, if you ever draw this graph, right, which we are going to talk about later, if you draw this graph and in any situation, if there is a circular wait, okay, I am waiting for someone, that is waiting for someone, that is waiting for someone, and that is waiting for me, right? If any of these condition happens, right, that is a circular wait. And if all of these 4 conditions are existing in any process cycle or in any operating system, a deadlock is bound to happen. And all of these needs to be there. Okay. These 4 conditions are not completely independent. Okay. Why? As the circular wait condition basically means hold and wait only. Don't think that these all conditions are independent. Okay. Circular wait is nothing but hold and wait, right? When it was happening in a circular way, I was holding a resource also and I was requesting a resource only. Okay. So we can say that circular wait basically implies hold and wait only. Okay. But we still emphasize on the fact that all the 4 conditions must hold for a deadlock. Okay. So these are the 4 conditions which help us to define the deadlock. Okay. In the next video, we are first going to understand about resource allocation graphs. Okay, how do we define for a particular system which has multiple processes and multiple resources? How do we draw this graph kind of like a structure? Okay, and then talk a little bit about resource allocation graphs. And once we have that understanding, then we will go ahead and move to talking about how can we really, avoid deadlocks, right? What are the different conditions using which the deadlocks can be avoided? Okay, so with this, I hope this video is clear to everyone. What we did cover in this video first was how do we understand deadlocks, right? What are deadlocks? What is the condition, right? And then we talked about the difference between a deadlock and a starvation. And then we talked about what are the 4 conditions which can actually lead to a deadlock, and all the 4 conditions should be true. That was mutual exclusion, hold and wait, no preemption, and circular wait. Okay. So I hope this is clear to everyone, and in the next video, we'll talk our discussion and start about resource allocation graphs. Thank you so much for taking a look at this video, and I'll meet you in the next one. Bye.